Okay, so regarding the question of why the Supreme Court doesn't get involved, the Supreme Court has basically considered this to be a political question. So a political question simply means that the issue of partisan gerrymandering is something that is to be left to the electoral process, and the court doesn't want to get involved and be the referee. So even though it may be unfair to the Democratic Party, when you look at the state of Texas and how overtly partisan they are, drawing to Republicans' advantage, uh, you know, it's still not something they want to get involved with. They just have said this is not a matter of equality. This is a matter of politics. Okay, going back to the outline. The next question is, which committees are most influential, and how can a committee assignment make or break a congressional career? And how can House leadership weaponize committee placement? So if we go back over to our list of committees, well, most important committees really depends on what time period we're living in, but usually appropriations is one of the most important because it has to do with spending. Armed services, if we're in a time of war, then obviously that's a really important one because that's, the largest bureaucratic agency is the Defense Department. And there are others, energy and commerce. If you're into regulation, that's a really important one. Don't forget that the Commerce Clause allows almost all kinds of regulatory matters. So all the regulatory agencies have a strong connection to energy and commerce. And then, there's some other ones that we can talk about. But and then one that is going to come up later on is the Ways and Means and the Rules Committee. We'll talk about those here in a little bit. Okay, so how can it make or break a congressional career? Well, look at John Culberson, the guy who was bragging about the freeway. He's even though he got voted out of office because of a very expensive campaign against him, they spent tens of millions of dollars to win his seat. The Democrats did. It still enhanced his career while he was in office because he could take credit for that. And then, of course, leadership, that'd be Nancy Pelosi, can weaponize committee placement by simply threatening, hey, if you're not going to go along with our agenda, fine. I got another person that would love to have your chairmanship, and that's kind of how that game is played. Okay, this portion of the outline is just something that happened in 2019. Probably it's getting a little dated, but it shows that there is a difference in the type of power exercised by these new members of Congress who are Twitter famous, and the old stalwart type of power represented by Nancy Pelosi and her, speakership, where she can control committee assignments and stuff like that. So this is really, you can read it on your own, but Nancy Pelosi made some news because she disrespected this, what they call the squad. So here's AOC and these other young female, also happen to be minority members, non-white, in other words, members of Congress that, but her point was that, look, they got Twitter, but they only have 4 votes in the House. There's 435 votes, they only got 4. And so she kind of ruffled some feathers with that commentary. And then political cartoonists also had a heyday with that. Here's Nancy Pelosi. So she's paving the pathway for legislation. And she's just worked hard to get the pathway to where it's, almost settled. And then what do? They come like children and run all the way through it and mess it up. Okay, so that's what this cartoonist is saying. And here, she's kind of illustrating that the power dynamic in Washington is really changing with the advent of Twitter and things like that, because she no longer has the control that you would think the speaker would have. Okay. So we can talk more about that. All right. The House is said to be rules driven. What does that mean? It means that because it's so large, they depend on rules. And rules, there's a rules committee, and there's different types of rules that can be applied to legislation. An open rule, for example, would allow amendments to be added on a virtually unlimited basis, even what are called non-germane amendments, which don't even relate to the bill. Or it could operate on a closed rule where they really tightly control how that legislation is passed through the House. So that's what the Rules Committee does, is they establish rules on pieces of legislation. Now, the Committee of the Whole is something that rarely meets, and it is when the State of the Union speech is given. That is really the only meeting of the Committee of the Whole where all of the members of the House and Senate come together. So usually during bills, there's a vote that's scheduled. They do not come in and assemble and take their seats and vote. They have these voting machines. And so this is live, or this is video from an actual vote in progress that I just found on YouTube here, just kind of randomly. And you can see they're kind of milling around. No one's really, there are some people speaking, but they're just not all assembled at one time seated. Okay, so let's go back out of this and back to the outline. Okay, on to the Senate. The Senate obviously is very different. A lot of this is review, so we'll go through it pretty quickly. The confirmation role of the Senate is really, really important. The Senate has much more relaxed rules because they have a longer term. It's more prestigious to be a senator. And of course, one of those big rules is the filibuster. And we've talked a lot in class about how the filibuster and holds are really achieve the same goal, which is to stop legislation and force a 60 vote threshold to pass legislation. So that's really tough to get. A unanimous consent agreement is something that you definitely need to know about. And it happens typically in the Senate if there's something urgent or non-controversial. So if it's something urgent, okay, so when COVID hit initially and everybody was freaking out, and they shut all the businesses down, well, obviously that impacted people's finances. And so they passed the stimulus to give everyone, some money by unanimous consent. And what that does is it prohibits a hold or a filibuster. So even though members of the Senate have this power, if they agree to a unanimous consent agreement, then there will be no filibuster or holds because they've already agreed in advance not to. So the unanimous consent agreement is very similar to in the House what the function of the Rules Committee is. And by the way, that is a testable moment in the government ramblings today. Okay, so unanimous consent agreement offers something similar to the Rules Committee in the House. Okay, we've already had this discussion, and the nuclear option. Should we get rid of the filibuster with the nuclear option? You guys are going to write about that. So, I will just say this: Madison would be rolling over in his grave if he heard this talk of getting rid of the filibuster, because it totally negates the power of the minority, and it goes contrary to pluralism, which is what Madison was really advocating in large part, because you no longer have a marketplace of ideas. You just have domination by the party in power. And that's not conducive to, political harmony. Okay, I have this section called Fraction Mania, and real quickly, simple majority means one more than half. Supermajority means 2/3, always. A cloture vote is 3/5 in the Senate only. So this little chart here is for you to kind of peruse, and very, very quickly, in the House and Senate, okay, to pass legislation, if no one's opposed to it, simple majority is all you need, House and Senate. But if one senator says no, or not so fast, then the threshold increases to 60 votes. Okay. Simple legislation, when there's divided party control, that's when the House and the Senate are opposite parties. That would almost certainly require a cloture vote in the Senate, but a simple majority always in the House. Passing legislation under divided party control where they use the nuclear option. So if they do change the rule, which again has not happened for legislation, it has happened for judicial appointments, then the threshold goes down to a simple majority. Overriding a presidential veto, supermajority in both houses. So 2/3 vote in both houses to override a veto, very tough to do. And I feel like I forgot something here. We'll get to it in a minute. Okay. Ratifying treaties. is something that only occurs in the Senate, supermajority. The confirmation vote for presidential appointments, a majority vote. If it's non-controversial, if it is controversial, it's a 60 vote threshold. Again, for non-judicial nominees. So the president's cabinet, a simple majority vote is all that's needed. But if somebody objects, then a cloture vote. And of course, the vote to impeach the president, surprisingly, only a simple majority is needed. To ratify the Constitution, to amend the Constitution, supermajority in both houses. To impeach the president, only a simple majority. That's why Trump was impeached twice, because the Democrats didn't like him and they just impeached him. And kind of, in my opinion, it's kind of, I always thought impeachment was for like, treason and stuff like that. And, so I guess people have disagreements over what Trump did and whether it's impeachable. But either way, it never reached the threshold required in the Senate, which is a supermajority. So they couldn't get 67 senators to vote to impeach. Okay, and then, of course, the nuclear option changes the vote threshold to a simple majority vote, and we already talked about that. So real quick, the lawmaking process, and I have a little infographic I'll direct you to guys to, and you can pause the video if you need to. But the bottom line is this, okay? Bills are always introduced in the House and Senate so it's introduced and then it immediately goes to a committee. The committee is where most of the work happens. It's where the markup happens. It's where the testimony is heard from witnesses. And most bills don't make it out of the committee process. If they do, then it goes to the full House, the full Senate, okay? And if it makes that, then you have a House version and a Senate version. And you can't have a House version and a Senate version. You have to have one version. So that's what the conference committee is for. So a conference committee is where the House and Senate work out their differences. And then it goes to the president. It goes back to the House and Senate for one final vote, and then it goes to the president. Now, what are the president's options? He can veto it, which is subject to an override, or he can sign it. It obviously becomes a law. But there are some other options. So let's go into our fill-in-the-blank notes here and finish out the lesson today. Okay. So when presented with a bill, the president may sign the bill, in which case it becomes a law. He can veto the bill, in which case the bill is dead, unless Congress overrides with a 2/3 vote. The president can do nothing, in which case the bill automatically becomes law in 10 days. And so here's the provision of the Constitution that says that. If any bill shall not be returned by the president within 10 days, it shall it shall have been presented to him. The same shall be a law in like manner as if he had signed it. So in other words, he has a 10-day clock starts running from the minute the bill is presented to the president. Okay. Now, if the president, and by the way, it refuses to sign a bill and there's less than 10 days left, this is called a pocket veto. Pocket veto. And it's kind of like, running out the clock at the end of a football game. There's simply not enough time, and the Congress can't veto it. So this is a good test question. Suppose that Congress passes a bill unanimously. The House and Senate unanimously vote on a bill. Well, they still got to give it to the president, and the president doesn't like it. So there's only 5 days left in the session. If the president vetoes it, it's going to get overridden. So if the president wants to make sure that it dies, he should not sign it, because then 10 days will not have gone by, and there's no opportunity to override the veto, and the bill dies. So again, it's called a pocket veto. And one last option we'll talk about briefly is the possibility of what's called a signing statement. So the president signs the bill, it becomes a law, but he issues a signing statement which opens the door to challenges, because one of the things that every president would love to have is something called a line item veto, L-I-N-E, line item veto. In other words, if the president sees a piece of legislation, okay, so let's find a nice piece of legislation here. So here it is. Okay, and the president's scrolling through it, he's looking at it, he's like, oh, you know what, this voting by mail stuff, you know what, I'm gonna sign the bill, but I'm gonna cross that out because I think that's just, too much or whatever. Okay, that would be a line item veto. The president does not have that power. And so what the president can do is sign the legislation, but say, you know what, that provision about the mail-in voting stuff, I'm not so sure about it. And that then could invite lawsuits, because while the president can't veto parts of legislation, to use a golf analogy, you got to play it as it lies. He has to either sign the whole thing or veto the whole thing. You know who can cancel part of a piece of legislation? The Supreme Court. And so a signing statement is going to invite those legal challenges that the Supreme Court could adjudicate and potentially invalidate part of a law. All right, that is the end of the lesson today. Hope you guys didn't fall asleep. We'll see you guys tomorrow, hopefully in class. I just not quite there yet in the way I feel. So we'll see you guys Friday.